Well, good. Good morning, everybody. And, my first happy responsibility is to thank all of you. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I mean, I know two things. One, how important it is to be communicating the faith to the next generation. Secondly, how hard it is today, especially with the rising tide of secularism and kind of indifferentism. It's always hard to teach young kids. I mean, it's always difficult. It's a challenge. But I think especially today, it's a challenge. So thank you. And I say that on my own behalf, but also on behalf of the church. What you do is supremely important. And God bless you for your willingness, to share the faith with young people. So good. What I want to talk about today, you know this. I've been beating this drum for a long time. To stop dumbing down the faith, to present the faith in an intellectually compelling way. And I say it, everybody, not just because, my background is in teaching and theology and philosophy. I say it because of my study of the unaffiliated. The last several years, I've been really paying a lot of attention to the surveys of the so-called nones, right? The N-O-N-E-S, those who have disaffiliated from religion. The numbers, I've shared them many times, are startling. 26% of our country right now would say they have no religion. It was 3% when I was a kid. So it's a tremendous increase, and it's worse among younger people. 30 and younger, the numbers go up to as high as 40%. And furthermore, the kids that you're dealing with, most of you, that's where the battle's being fought. That a lot of people are disaffiliating younger and younger. Now, as part of those surveys, something I've discovered is when they ask, how come you left? Well, they give a variety of reasons. That's true. And I've given presentations on all the different reasons. But time and again, number one reason that the young people give for leaving is, I don't believe the teachings. I don't believe the doctrines. Another way they put it is this: I never got my questions really answered. Now, again, there are other reasons they give for disaffiliating. It's not just this, but I'm continually impressed by the fact that number one reason is, for want of a better term, an intellectual reason. They were not intellectually satisfied by what they were hearing in our classes and courses. Now, again, everyone, please, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying for a second that the whole thing should be reduced to, academics and to theological correctness. No. All the things that we do, and I'm talking here about forming young people in prayer, forming them in liturgy, forming them in a good community sensibility, forming them in retreat experiences, forming them through outreach to the poor and the sick and the marginalized. Those are all super important. So please don't misunderstand me as though I'm saying all that secondary. It's not. In fact, when you look at the surveys, many of the disaffiliated will say, I do fondly remember prayer experiences. I do fondly remember retreat experiences. And maybe above all, they'll say, I fondly remember when we were encouraged to do works of social justice. So those things remain of tremendous importance. Keep doing them, please. But can I suggest we should put a renewed stress on answering the questions that they have, is addressing some of the concerns that they say were not answered in their religious ed classes. And I want to make it now even a little more precise. I don't know if you guys know about the website Reddit, R-E-D-D-I-T. Well, Reddit is one of the most popular websites in the whole world, and it's a forum for the exchange of ideas and opinions. The people that use it are disproportionately younger people and probably disproportionately males over females. They'll say young men from 18 to 30, but generally it's younger people use Reddit. Well, Reddit has a feature, and my Word on Fire folks told me about this a couple years ago, called AMA. And AMA means Ask Me Anything. So people come on Reddit from different walks of life, and they'll say, I'm so-and-so, and they could be famous people, or they represent some walk of life, and they say, AMA, ask me anything. and then the debate ensues, right? So I was encouraged to get on there simply to announce myself as I'm a Catholic bishop who loves to engage atheists and seekers and non-believers, right? So I would be willing to bet most people, 98% of people on Reddit, didn't know who I am. But I announced myself that way. I'm a Catholic bishop that loves to engage seekers and non-believers. Well, I've done it twice now. First time, I was the number 3 most popular Reddit in the whole year. I was right after like Bernie Sanders and Jordan Peterson, no kidding. The second time I did it, I was number 2 in the country after I think Bernie Sanders. Now, again, I'm saying it not because they know who I am. I'm sure they didn't know who I am. But that a religious person came on this website frequented by young people and said, hey, ask me anything. And it proved to be massively popular. Now, massively obscene, massively, obnoxious and all that too. Believe me, you're going to hear everything on Reddit. But I got, in both cases, like tens of thousands of questions, observations, etc. Now, once you wade through all the kind of obnoxious, obscene things and all that, and there's plenty of it, but you can discover a lot of really good, honest questions. And they fell very recognizably into certain patterns. And what I want to do is share with you the top 3 questions I got on my 2 times on Reddit AMA, and then try to say something about each one. So that's the way I'm going to structure the talk today. Here are the 3 questions. No doubt at all that these were the number 1 or top 3. First one, is there a God? Bishop, prove to me there's a God. I heard that thousands and thousands of times. Second one, what about the problem of evil and suffering? So, Bishop, you say there's an all-loving God, but yet the world is full of all this suffering and negativity. How do you explain that? Third one, and I found this one maybe most intriguing because I wasn't quite expecting it. Third one, though, real popular. How do you know, of all the religions of the world and all the religious philosophies, that somehow your religion is the right religion? You can check it, by the way. I think you can still find, I don't know how long they're up there, but just look it up on Reddit, look up my name, and you can find these streams of questions, and you'll find these are the top 3. So what I want to do now in just this brief time, and I hope I have a chance to engage you too, is just say something about each one of these 3 leading questions, because trust me when I tell you, the young people you're dealing with, they got these questions. Okay, so first of all, God's existence. Is there a God? I can't tell you how many times I heard it. Show me there's a God. Prove to me that God exists. And boy, how many times did they say something like, and people just told me when I was growing up, just believe it. Just have faith in it. And they tell me that is not enough. That did not satisfy me. But one thing that really struck me, I don't think I one time on Reddit saw anybody engaging any of the famous arguments for God's existence. Even though, gosh, in our tradition, as you well know, there are a lot of them. There's a book I just read recently, and it was dealing with about 24 of the classical arguments for God's existence that people have developed over the centuries. But on Reddit AMA, not one kid ever said to me, oh, and by the way, I listened to this argument, and here's why I don't agree with it. No, it's as though they'd never heard of them. It was just a matter of this kind of kooky belief that my teachers proposed to me, and there's no good reason for it, and I don't get it. So that struck me as interesting that somehow we, and by we here I mean all of us involved in religious education, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, everything else, that somehow we have not communicated well to our young people that there is a very richly intellectual tradition around this question. So I said there are 24, there are many more than that too. Can I just explore with you 2 approaches to God? And my starting point for each one is going to be something that I think young people find especially compelling. So let me just talk about 2 of them. The first one begins with the sciences. And I'm being purposely a little bit provocative here because, boy, one thing you hear from the young people is, well, science disproves religion. You know, religion makes all these kooky claims, and then science came along, and boy, it's got, empirical analysis, and it forms hypotheses in a responsible way. It does experiments, it draws conclusions. We have testable results, and the sciences have produced the technology. It's working right now for all of us. But from the iPhone that every kid has in his pocket, it's produced a technology which has made life so much richer and better and more comfortable. And so, heck, the sciences seem great. And haven't they disproven religion? And they look at religion, and again, I heard this like crazy on the Reddit forum. These old texts from the ancient world that seem so crazy and contradictory, and so much has been debated and unresolved and murky. So you get that. Religion seems kind of shaky and ancient and questionable, and then the sciences seem so smart and testable and beneficial. So if it's a war between religion and science on those terms, guess who's going to win? And the kids say it all the time. Science is better than religion. Science disproves religion. Okay. And I've talked about this I can't go into all the details about religion and science, but what I want to do here is to start actually with the sciences. Start at the very heart of all the sciences. What is the basic assumption? And I would call it, everybody, frankly, a mystical assumption that stands behind all the sciences. Whether it's psychology, it's biology, it's chemistry, it's physics, whatever it is, the assumption that stands behind all the sciences is that reality is intelligible. Fancy way of saying it can be known. It has a pattern that corresponds to the questing mind. Now think about it for a second. If the world was just a chaotic jumble, well, how would the scientists go out to meet it? With what kind of confidence? If the world was just chaotic jumble of nonsense, no scientific mind would go out to meet it with confidence. Rather, there's something like pattern, form, intelligibility on the grandest possible scheme and in every nook and cranny of the universe. In fact, isn't it interesting? I remember talking to my nephew. My nephew Drew is a really smart kid. He's a senior now at MIT. So doing the highest level, right? Math and physics and all that stuff. And I said, Drew, what I find really interesting is that reality, as you're analyzing it, as an engineer now, corresponds to the most complex mathematics. As you're analyzing the world, so you can build bridges and build buildings and construct things and so on. Well, you're using the most sophisticated, complex mathematics to do that work. Well, why does it work that way? Why would that complex mathematics correspond to the real world that you're dealing with? Where does the order, pattern, and intelligibility of the world come from? Einstein said this. He has a lot of interesting quotes about kind of science and religion, but my favorite is this one. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, right? Because the more you stare at that, the stranger it becomes, right? Why should the world have these incredibly complex mathematical patterns of intelligibility? But it does, because otherwise the sciences wouldn't even get off the ground. Joseph Ratzinger, in his wonderful Introduction to Christianity, of course, Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict XVI. Ratzinger says, the only finally satisfying explanation for the intelligibility of the world is some intelligence which has placed that patternness, that order, that intelligibility into things. Ratzinger observed something, I've always loved this. He said, our language gives this away. Because when we come to know something, we say that we recognize it, right? I recognize the truth of that. Recognize, recognize, right? I think again what's already been thought. Now, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and through that Word all things came to be. The great claim of the Bible is the world is not dumbly there. The world is intelligibly there because it has been spoken into being. Don't literalize that language. That's beautiful high poetry to express what I've just been describing. The world's not dumbly there. It's not chaotically there, but rather it's intelligibly there because it's been known into being by a great primordial intelligence. Another thing that's interesting, everybody, many have pointed out, Ratzinger included, it's no accident that the modern physical sciences that we all honor and reverence as we should emerged when and where they did, which is to say, out of the great Christian universities of Europe. They came out of a thought world that took for granted creation, the idea that all of reality has been stamped by a primordial intelligence. And look at the first great scientists, almost without exception. They were all devoutly religious people because the sciences came up out of that matrix. I'll leave you just with this quote from Paul Davies. Paul Davies is a very interesting Australian physicist, high-level physicist, but writes a lot about science and religion. He wrote an article where he was kind of tweaking the noses of his scientific colleagues. And his simple question was this: where do you think the laws of nature come from? That's a good question. So he's making the point that I'm trying to make here, that all of the sciences rest upon the assumption that there's a law-like quality to reality. Where's that come from? How do you explain that? I might suggest it's a good way for our young people who are properly enamored of the sciences to see the link between science and religion. They're not enemies. No, in fact, religion is right there at the very heart of science, if we look at it the right way. Okay, here's my second approach. So that's the first one through science. The second one also starts with something I think almost all young people take for granted and reverence. I'm talking about the objectivity of moral value. The objectivity of moral value. Now, I don't mean here that we should start with the church's sexual teaching. They don't like the church's sexual teaching. So that comes through in every single survey. I'm not saying the church's sexual teaching is wrong. I don't think it's wrong. But the young people don't like it. So I wouldn't recommend starting with that. However, almost without exception, they do like the great values of social justice, don't they? You talk to young people, what really motivates them? That there are these great social justice values, that you shouldn't abuse the poor and the marginalized, that you should not be sexist, that you should not be oppressive, that something like slavery is clearly wrong, that human trafficking, that's a terrible thing. Racism, that's wrong. I mean, I don't know one young person that would disagree with any of that. Do you? Well, what they're acknowledging is there's an objective moral value involved there. If you were to say, no, I think morality is just a question of, your subjective opinion. So, yeah, you think slavery is a bad thing, but if someone else thinks slavery is okay, well, that's all right. We should be tolerant and inclusive. I don't know one young person that would say that. Do you? Or, with sexism, sure, I think that's wrong. It's my subjective opinion. But someone else, they might think, no, sexism is fine. Would they buy that? Or, the Nazis, sure, I think that's a terrible thing what Hitler did. But, if that was the consensus of the people of that time, who am I to tell them when they're wrong? I don't know any young person that would ever say such a thing. You see, what they're resisting, and they're dead right about it, they're resisting the tendency to turn objective moral value into simply a matter of subjective preference. Now, I know, we so highly value inclusivity and diversity and all those good things. But when it comes to these primal moral truths, I don't find young people subjectivist at all. I think they hold to objective moral value. Okay, just as in the scientific order, where do the laws of nature come from? Where do these objective intelligibilities come from? So here now, in the moral order, where do these objective moral values come from? Oh, they just come from the societal consensus. No. Because 1935 in Germany, there was a societal consensus that it was perfectly fine to imprison Jews and put them to death. Oh, no, that's just, a matter of subjective opinion. No, you don't hold that. You hold to the objectivity of these values. Where do they come from? How do you explain them? What does the Bible witness to, everybody, over and over again? That God is the great lawgiver that stands behind the objective moral laws that we intuit. How is God described? As the giver of commandments. Now again, I know right away they think sexual morality and tell me what to do. So bracket sexual morality for a moment. Go back to these things I've been talking about. Do you think slavery, human trafficking, racism are objectively wrong? Yeah. Where does that come from? Where did those objective states of affairs come from? They can't come from my private opinion. They can't come from the consensus of my community. They come, in fact, the Bible says, from this great moral lawgiver whom we call God. Just a last connection. Isn't it interesting? John Henry Newman saw this. That we refer to the conscience as a voice. Think about that. It's curious because, I've got, let's say, an aesthetic sensibility where I make judgments about works of art. And, that's beautiful, and that's it, and that's not, or that's more beautiful than this. Okay, now, if I make a mistake in that order, I don't feel ashamed. I might feel stupid, or I might feel, uninformed or something, but I don't feel ashamed that I made a bad aesthetic judgment. Or if I make a mistake in my mathematical calculation, I might feel stupid, but not ashamed. But when I go against objective moral value, how do I feel? Not just stupid or uninformed, I feel ashamed. Now why? Because I know I've offended someone. You see what the voice of conscience, not just an attitude or a sensibility, it's a voice. It's someone who has given these objective moral values to the world. And when I run counter to them, I feel under judgment. Now, turn it around, make it positive. When I do something right, when I liberate someone who's oppressed, when I fight against racism, when I fight against all forms of slavery, what do I feel? Well, not just, hey, that was a right judgment. No, I feel joyful in the presence of someone who approves of this. Where do physical laws come from? The great intelligence that placed them there. Where do moral laws come from? From the great moral lawgiver in whose presence I feel lifted up or ashamed, depending on how I behave morally. Now, can I suggest, fellow teachers, start with these two approaches. There are many more you could use, but start with these two. Start with two things that they reverence, the sciences and objective moral values. And then keep pushing. Where do they come from? What explains them? What grounds them? I think at the very least, you're going to have a cool discussion. You have an interesting, engaged discussion. Okay, that's question one, the question of God, of God's existence. Here's question two in the Reddit AMA, all over the place. the problem of suffering. Okay, if you believe in a God who's all good, all loving, all knowing, all powerful, how could there be such evil in the world? You know, you can invoke the Holocaust and the Black Death, but heck, one child dying of leukemia is enough to start this argument. How do you explain that? Thomas Aquinas, by the way, you know, the way Thomas wrote is when he was laying out his position, he would precede it with objections. It's clever, and it's important for us today because we tend to dismiss our opponents, but Thomas laid out their arguments really clearly and persuasively. Here's the way he argued against God's existence. Thomas said, if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. Like if there were an infinite heat, there'd be no cold, right? But God is described as the infinite good. Okay? Therefore, wouldn't that eliminate all evil? There's an infinite good. But there is evil. Therefore, God does not exist. That's in Thomas Aquinas. That's his objection. And may I say, that's a darn good argument. That's a really good argument. And the young people, they might not, express it that pithily, but they feel it. That's exactly what they're feeling. Hey, if there's an infinitely good God, how could there be any evil? Good argument. Okay, how do we begin to respond to this sort of concern? Well, going back to Thomas Aquinas and before him to St. Augustine, the classical answer is God doesn't create evil because evil is like a parasite, right? Evil isn't something positive. Evil's a lack of being. Think of like a cavity in a tooth, right? What's evil is the lack of something. Remember in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, those, what they call the Nazguls that fly around on their, they're these wicked figures, and they're cloaked with the hood. But then it's uncovered that actually when the hood comes off, there's nothing there. And Tolkien's making the same point that evil is not substantive. It's always a shadow or it's a parasite. You see what I'm saying? It's a lack of good that ought to be there. So God doesn't create evil, or evil isn't standing against God as a rival. But still, the question remains, okay, God didn't create it, but God permits it then. And here's the answer. So that from it, there might come some greater good. That's the principle. God permits evil and suffering so as to bring out of them a greater good. Now, can we see this sometimes in life? Yeah, sometimes we can pretty easily. So think of someone, boy, they wanted that job. They were really trying to get that job, and they interviewed for it, and they prayed for it, and they didn't get it. And they were bitterly disappointed. But then because of that, they took another job that proved to be, in fact, so much better than the job that they were initially going for, right? So that evil, that suffering actually led to something much better. Or I know this is my pastoral experience. Someone, boy, they wanted to get into that university. That's the one I want. And I applied for it and I wrote the essay and I hoped and I prayed. And then I didn't get into that university, which is what I wanted with all my heart. And I was bitterly disappointed and angry. But then I went to another school. And at that school, I met the woman who became my wife, who's been now the center of my whole life, the mother of my children. And if I had gotten into that first university, I never would have had that experience. Okay, and we can all multiply stories like that, where we do see the principle that sometimes evil brings about a greater good that wouldn't happen otherwise. Or people, we know this pastorally, that go through tremendous suffering, physical suffering. But out of that suffering comes a deeper sense of God or of compassion. So yeah, my point is we all get that principle. At the same time, let's be honest, often we don't get it. Often suffering just seems dumb, that it doesn't lead to something better. It just seems like dumb suffering. We can't see, oh yeah, because of it, something great happened. Does that undermine the argument? No, and here's why. we got to remember that God is not like one agent among many. So, you and I are all doing our various things and trying to get the best situation. But God isn't like that. God is the creator of all things, provident over all reality, over all of space and all of time. Why does God permit a given evil or suffering? Maybe I can't see it in this life, in this world, with my very narrow, limited vision. But does that mean it has no purpose? No. Now, everybody, revisit the book of Job. And I think if this is like the number 2 question that young people have, I think in our classes, if we spend some good time with the book of Job, which is the greatest Old Testament wrestling with this question. Remember, Job, righteous Job, the good man, the best man on earth. And then every possible suffering befalls him. And Job cries out to God, like we all do, like these young people do. How did you explain this? Explain this to me. Why am I going through this suffering? His friends try to explain it with their different theological perspectives, and Job finds none of it convincing, and finally calls God into the dock, right? Explain yourself to me. Why? And then have the kids read this. It's Job chapter 40, I think. God speaks out of the whirlwind. Whirlwind, the dust and the eyes. You can't see this overwhelming reality of God. And it's the longest speech by God in the Old Testament. It's cool. The longest speech by God in the Old Testament is on this question. And it begins famously, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Where were you? In other words, God takes Job on a tour of the whole cosmos that he's made. The point being, Job, your suffering is not just about you, but is ingredient in my providential concern for the whole of reality. Now, that highfalutin stuff from philosophy in the book of Job, can I make it a bit more concrete with 2 examples? First one's a little bit silly, second one's more serious. When I was a little kid, we had a dog named Tiger, because I lived outside Detroit, so we loved the Detroit Tigers. And so we had a beautiful collie named Tiger. Well, Tiger was a great dog, but like all dogs, hated the vet, right? And he kind of knew, we didn't take him in the car that often. He kind of knew when we were taking him to the vet, and he would get completely beside himself. We'd arrive at the place, he'd start to tremble. We'd take him in, and this one time we took him in for shots. It was something simple. But the poor dog was just trembling, So I remember the vet, I'm a little guy, I'm like 7 or 8 years old. And he says, why don't you hold him? So I kind of held him around his neck like this. And then the vet gave him shots, But here's what I remember, and it's vividly in my mind, even though it was decades ago, is Tiger, how dogs, they're not as expressive as we are, but dogs can be pretty expressive. A dog can express what he or she is feeling, right? So Tiger looked at me, and the look said, why are you doing this to me? So, Tiger knew I was like his buddy. I'm his best friend, And yet I was there in this awful place, the vet, while he's going through this terrible thing that he didn't understand and was just causing him pain. And he was looking at me as if to say, why are you doing this to me? So anyway, Tiger is giving me this look. And what occurred to me, even then, I'm like 7 or 8 years old. Even then, I remember thinking, I wish I could explain this to you, But the difference between even my little 7-year-old human mind and his mind was so great that I couldn't even in principle explain it to him. Well, Tiger, listen, these are shots and they're going to awaken your immune system in a new way, and it's going to prevent you from getting sicker later. So I know it's a little tough, but just endure it and you'll be better. This actually is good for you, what you're going through. Well, I couldn't even begin to explain it to him. And the frustration I felt at that I knew what the point of this suffering was, but I couldn't communicate it to him. Now, here's the second story. It's along the same lines, but it's more serious because it was in my pastoral work. I was newly ordained, so this is a long time ago. And this young father came to me, young guy, probably early 30s. And he said, Father, I'm going through this terrible time. I said, what's up? Well, his son, who was about 3, I think, had some physical issue. I forget what it was. But it required surgery. And so the father was there with him at the hospital. The kid went through the surgery. And then afterwards, there was this young kid in great pain, right? Physical pain, but also in great psychological pain because he's in this terrible place, this hospital he didn't know, surrounded by strangers, in great pain. And his dad was right there with him. And the father said to me, it brought Tiger back to my mind, because the father said to me, I couldn't explain it to him. I wanted to tell him why he had to go through this surgery, and they removed something, which means you'll be better in the long run, and you got to go through a difficult time, but you'll actually be much better, and if we hadn't done this, you might have died. Well, I mean, the 3-year-old kid's not able to take all that in. And the father looked at me with this sense of deep frustration. And I thought, so it goes with our God, who has concern for all of space and all of time, who's the Lord of all things. What we take in is a little tiny swatch of space and time, right? Little tiny bit. From our perspective, yes, indeed, some suffering just seems like dumb suffering. And there's not much we can really do about that. And is it possible that God, even in principle, couldn't explain it to us? Here's one more little story, also from my pastoral time. I was helping out at a parish near Chicago, and every week, practically, I would see this family, parents, about 5 kids. And they sat right up in front because one of their daughters, she was about 8 maybe at the time, was profoundly handicapped, both physically and mentally. And she was kind of strapped into a chair, and profoundly affected. And then often during Mass, she'd get agitated or she'd get fussy and she'd start vocalizing and, kind of squirming in the chair. And I was just always struck by the tremendous suffering she's going through and that the whole family for all these years, has gone through. But the person I noticed alongside the young girl was her brother, who was, I think, a bit younger than she, maybe like 7. And week after week, this young kid, when his sister got agitated, would, with such care and compassion and simplicity and not drawing attention to himself, would attend to her, would comfort her and talk to her, Now, I never came to know this family all that well, but they've never left my mind. And I'll tell you why. Because why would God allow this? Why would God allow this poor girl to suffer? Why would he put her family through this? Well, look, I don't know. I don't know. But I used to muse. Maybe that brother is developing a heart of such compassion that when he comes of age, he passes that on to his son, who then passes on to his daughter, who becomes a saint at the moment the church most needs that saint. Now, look, I'm speculating here, everybody. I'm just kind of musing. My point is, God has command of all of space and all of time. Why are certain evils going on? Well, maybe it's not even, the answer is not even to come in our lifetime. Maybe it's not for us so much. It's for something far in the future. I don't know. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Says God to Job. And says God to us too. But, look, my holding Tiger around his neck while he was going through this. The father sitting with his son, even though he couldn't explain it to him. That brother caring for his sister, even though he couldn't explain it to her. Our God is like that too. Maybe not able to give the answer that we want and need, but present to us in compassion as we suffer. It seems to me that's the answer, in quotes, the answer by our great tradition. Again, I'm not trying to solve this thing, but it might be a good way to engage the minds and hearts of young people is to address this question head on about suffering. Okay, I've been going on a little bit too long. Let me draw to a close a little more quickly with number 3. The third question they asked over and over again, well, why be a Christian? So come on, Bishop, aren't there, hundreds of religions and they're all good and, we're all climbing the holy mountain by different routes. And so you got your path, but other people have their paths. And, who are you to be saying your religion is right? Why don't we just say we tolerate all religions and, we got one among many? Well, as I say, this is a huge value today, as we all know. Inclusivity and tolerance and diversity is a huge value. But what's the danger, of course, is if we hyper-stress these things, it can undermine our sense of evangelical enthusiasm. Go forth and preach to all nations. He didn't say go forth and just, be tolerant toward all religions. He said go forth and preach this gospel to all nations. Now, mind you, never in a violent way, never in a way that's disrespectful. Vatican II clearly teaches there are elements of truth and goodness and beauty in all the great religions. That's certainly true. I don't deny that for 1 second. However, we do hold that God has revealed his heart most fully in the great tradition of Israel, culminating in Jesus Christ crucified and risen from the dead. And this is the great message that God wants the church to communicate to the world. And so it does matter that we're Christians. And let me just try to articulate that in terms of a few simple points. Christianity claims, first, a personal God. Now, I know that can seem kind of obvious, but it's not. You look at the great religions and spiritualities and religious philosophies of the world, by no means do they all hold to a personal God. Very often God is portrayed as a force or an energy. Think of Star Wars. Star Wars expresses an old philosophical perspective. Go east of the Suez, as Joseph Campbell said, and you'll find a very impersonal sense of God. Christianity holds, no, God's not a force or an energy, but a person with mind, will, purpose, freedom. Secondly, and relatedly, Christianity is not the story of our quest for God. Go to any bookstore, go online, you'll find a million titles, all about the human quest for God. Fine, good, there's something to that, obviously. But Christianity, biblical religion, is not primarily about our quest for God. Ho-hum, finally. As though God is kind of dumbly out there and then we just have to go climbing up toward him. No. The Bible is the story of God's quest for us. And that makes all the difference. That's a qualitatively different approach to religion. It's about God coming after us. It's about the hound of heaven, right? Running after us as we run away from God. God is not like just the holy mountain waiting for us to climb. It's like the mountain's coming after us, But it's the personal God who is actively seeking a relationship with us. That's a different texture. That's a unique texture in religion. Thirdly and relatedly, Christianity is not a religion of karma. It's a religion of grace. And I'm making kind of a broad distinction here, but you know what I mean. Religions of karma, and karma is a great principle. Think of John Lennon's instant karma. Karma is a principle of justice and retribution. So, if some harm is done, it needs to be repaired. There's an injustice, it needs to be answered and set right. It's like a reestablishment of a cosmic harmony. And you'll find that in a lot of different religions, especially religions of the East. And again, I like karma, and you'll find some of it in the Bible. That's true. There's some sense of karma or redressing a wrong or setting things right. But the Bible is not primarily a karmic religion. It's a religion of grace. What do I mean? I mean the personal God who's after us, loves us even when we don't deserve it. is not just a God of justice, but is a God of superabundant love. Gratia is a free gift beyond what we deserve, beyond what we merit. And fourthly, and relatedly, Christianity is a religion of incarnation. So watch the trajectory here. The personal God who's looking for us, who loves us when we don't deserve it, loves us, what does John 3:16 say? God so loved the world that he gave us his only son. God's gracious love is so intense that God becomes one of us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, why? So that we might be divinized. The church fathers said in their Latin, Deus fit homo ut homo fieret Deus. That means God became human that humans might become God. Now, say what you want about that. We could debate it, true or false, but that's a unique claim, everybody. There's no philosophy of religion, there's no other religion that makes a comparable claim. That the personal God who's after us and loved us so graciously that he became one of us that we might share in his life. Now, again, we can debate that. And you can say, well, I think that's crazy. But I don't know. That's a distinctive religion. That's a distinctive view. And I'll be honest with you, I speak now as an evangelist. If there's a more compelling religion than that, I'll join it. As far as I'm concerned, the personal God of gracious love that runs after me and becomes human so that he might draw me into his life, that's a pretty exciting message. In fact, that's the greatest humanism ever proposed by any religion or any philosophy in human history. God became one of us that we might become divine. I think that's a message still really worth propagating. And that's the answer to that question. Well, why be a Christian among all the religions? I don't know. To me, it's a pretty cool religion, Christianity, and it's worth proclaiming. Okay, I'll draw to a close there. Answers, responses anyway, or let's say the beginning of a good conversation about the three questions that seem to preoccupy young people the most. God bless you all. Thanks for listening.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop.
Incredible.
We do have time for a few questions, so
Good.
I would invite everyone, if you have a question for Bishop on the topic that he shared or about teaching. I know we want to ask him questions more about 6 or 7-year-old Bishop Barron, but let's not do that. Let's stay on topic and just put those in the chat box, and we'll get to those. And then, Bishop, I wanted to start, I was thinking while you were talking, across the board, the question that comes up the most is how to engage parents. Because a lot of times the children, no matter what age, get on board, but it's parents who are uncatechized or who have been away from the church for a while. So what would be your advice for all of us engaging parents?
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree with that. I mean, getting parents on board is essential. I would suggest they got the same questions, I bet. These top 3 questions, I bet every parent's got them too. And you say correctly, Teresa, that a lot of the parents who become either disaffiliated or just kind of maybe, bored with religion, I think stir them up with these 3 questions. I bet they've got them. And maybe start a good discussion with them around them. Here's something else. Do you guys know the work of Christian Smith? He's a professor at Notre Dame in the sociology of religion. And he's been studying this question of the nuns for a long time. He said once to us, I invited him when I was chair of the bishops' committee, I invited him to come and talk to us. And he said, one of the biggest changes is young people don't talk to their parents about religion. Now, I remember my mother, and I talked to my mother this morning by FaceTime. She's now in her upper 90s, still going strong. But I remember vividly, when I was a little kid, I'm like 10, 12 years old, my mother and I talking about religion. Now, my mother was a faithful Catholic, went to Mass on Sunday, but she loved talking about God, heaven, sin, grace. And I remember as a little kid talking to my mother about that. And then my mother wasn't super pious and religion on her sleeve, but it was like just a natural part of her life. Christian Smith says young people and their parents and their friends don't talk about religion. And that's a real problem. So how about engage these same questions with both parents and children and get them talking to each other about them?
Absolutely. Who would you say, besides your mom, was like a great teacher of the faith to you? Who sticks out?
Well,
I'm sure you have a whole list.
Father Tom Paulson, who's still alive, he's also, I think, in his upper 80s or early 90s. He was a professor at Fenwick High School when I was a kid. I was 14. And he presented one of Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God's existence, which changed my whole life. So he had a big impact on me. My mom, though, I would stress that again. My mother was not well educated. She went to high school, but she was and is smart, and just liked religious questions. She's kind of a natural theologian, without being trained in theology, but she had a natural feel for it. And and my dad. I mean, my father. You know, when I was a little kid, I thought he's the strongest guy I know, and he was kneeling one day at Mass, and it just struck me. Strongest guy I know, and he's kneeling to somebody stronger. And my father, again, not in a showy way, neither of my parents was showy about religion, but every Sunday, it wouldn't occur to them to miss Mass. By the way, another Christian Smith thing, and you know, at the risk of sounding sexist in any way, but especially the father's perdurance in the faith makes a difference to kids. If dad remains a faithful Mass goer, the kids tend to remain connected to the church. And he's not making, it's just a statistical fact, you know? So parents, absolutely, go to Mass and talk to your kids about religion, I would say.
Stephen wants to know, how do you respond to the comment that we as Catholics are not tolerant?
Well, some of us aren't. I mean, that's true. And we always should be. Again, but tolerant, it's one of those kind of tricky words, isn't it? Always responding in love, never in violence, never imposing, only proposing. So by tolerance, I would mean all of that. But it doesn't mean indifferentism. I think it can shade into a sort of subjectivism or indifferentism, like, well, who really cares what you believe? You know, we're all trying to be good people. But that's too strong, you know? You can be evangelical without being intolerant, you know? You can be boldly a proclaimer of the faith without being obnoxious about it and imposing it. So there's a middle ground there. I've often said, you know, Teresa, that in our culture, the two extremes seem to be violence on the one hand and bland toleration on the other hand, as if those are the only two options. And I think that a very happy third option is religious argument and religious engagement. That doesn't mean I'm attacking you or I'm trying to impose myself on you, but it also doesn't mean I'm just kind of, oh, who cares? No, let's like talk about, how about we talk about these three things? And I'm convinced that Christianity has really good answers to all three. Okay, I'm not being violent. I'm not imposing it, but I am proposing it with energy. I think that's still a valid path.
Absolutely. Anna wants to know, are there any books you might suggest that explain the three questions you went over? And I would like to add to that, any books in general for us just to go deeper into our faith and help us.
Yeah, I'm trying to think these three questions in particular. On God's existence, the one I'm referring to is kind of a hyper-technical book on the 24 arguments for God. You know, I think the works of Peter Kreeft, do you know Peter Kreeft? Kreeft. He writes a lot of really good substantive books, but are also pretty accessible, pretty easy to read. I'd recommend any of his things on God. You know, I mean, Word on Fire, we've tried to do a lot of things talking about these issues. I have a whole DVD series on the mystery of God. Maybe take a look at that. I just finished this book on the Creed. It should be coming out sometime next year. Might recommend that. But I think Peter Kreeft might be a good place to start.
Richard wants to know, how do you prepare teachers to answer and embrace the questions?
Well, how about we start with this? In other words, okay, here are the three questions. And I think that's pretty plain. Now, I've just given you a couple of suggestions. Start with those and then have a good conversation. See what ensues. So someone says, yeah, I don't find that very convincing. Well, how come? And let's have a good argument about it. So I don't know, start with the questions and maybe begin with the observations I've made here and then see what follows. But don't opt for either, okay, let's impose it on people or let's just blandly tolerate. Let's engage. So maybe start with these suggestions. And of course, everything I've said here today, it's nothing like new to me. It's all like just classical Catholic stuff, But start the conversation.
Absolutely. A few more here. Anitra, can you give me resources for parents who need answers to hot topic questions for their teens and adult children?
Yeah, a good book there, I'm just thinking of it, is Brandon Vaught, who works with us at Word on Fire, but Brandon also writes in his own name. And it's a book called Return. And it's all about how to bring people, especially young people, back to the faith who've wandered away. So go get that. Brandon, it's VOGT, Brandon Vaught, Return. That's a good place to start.
Nancy says, in my school community, one of the biggest challenges is that our parents do not attend Mass, especially now with the pandemic, even in a normal setting. How can we motivate them to seek the sacraments and especially attend Mass? Yeah,
tell me, please, because I'm bringing that up all the time. I worry about it. This is such a weird moment in the life of our church. We've never had this before. And I worry that people have been away for so long that they've been watching on TV, or maybe, a relative handful are going to our Masses outside now, maybe 100 or so. I worry about it. I do, because they're already staying away, a lot of people. We're already staying away from Mass, and then this thing happened. So I don't know, I'm wrestling with that too. I'm trying to figure it out. One suggestion I've made is everyone that comes, let's say to one of our Masses now, make a resolution that when the time comes, please God, sometime soon, when we can all come back to church, bring somebody that's been away for too long. Bring a family member, someone at work, but become a kind of a one-person evangelical crew and say, I'm going to find one or two and bring them back to Mass. But I'm still wrestling with that too. I'm not quite sure what the best answer is.
Marta says, how do we get the male figure, the father of the family, to understand the importance of partaking in the walk of faith with their children?
Yeah, tell them, first of all, that statistically it's true. And that, it just has a massive effect on the kids. So, I don't know, tell it, propagate it, explain it to people. But yeah, getting the parents involved is absolutely essential. It won't happen without that. I grew in my faith, and it's just, again, it wasn't so much explicit, it was more implicit, that I just knew it was very important to my parents. And when you're a little kid, your parents set the tone for your life in many ways. And so, yeah, of course you're religious. My mom and dad are. It was just taken for granted. But that's, I know, has changed a lot from the time I was a kid till today.
And what are some rules of engagement to have a good, they put argument, but I would say conversation.
Yeah, but you don't think, and I don't mind the word argument because I know it has this negative overtone like we're yelling at each other. But think of Thomas Aquinas. Is trading in argumentation. It just means making a case. It means, bringing your premises to bear, assembling your evidence, drawing conclusions. It's having a rational conversation. That's what an argument is, So teaching people how to have a good argument without becoming rancorous or without just giving up into like bland toleration, that's something we can really teach our young people, how to do that. One thing is to begin with their questions. That's what I did today, right? As I listened for days to these people on Reddit, and okay, I heard your questions. You think of Jesus now going to Emmaus, and hey, what are you guys talking about as you go? That's a really good evangelical starting point. He didn't start by preaching. He got there, mind you, but he started by, hey, what's on your mind? What are you guys talking about as you go? So what are you talking about in religion? These three. Is there a God? Why is there suffering? Why Christianity? All right, good. Now let's keep talking, But start with their questions.
Last question. What is your drink at Starbucks, Bishop?
I don't go to Starbucks that often. I like coffee a lot. In fact, I do have Starbucks at my house. We have the little, Keurig machine, and I got Starbucks coffee. I don't know what I like strong coffee. I hate when coffee tastes like just brown water. I like when it's like really got a strong punch to it. I can't have too much coffee. I get kind of too keyed up. My assistant, Sylvia, is also my wonderful Spanish teacher. During all these Zoom meetings, I've been all this time in my office, and she's learned to bring in, she has this kind of, we call it café especial that she makes for me. I don't know what she puts in it, but it really packs a punch, and it keeps me awake during all the Zoom meetings. So
Oh, that's
I do
great. Love
I do
her.
like coffee, yeah.
Great. Well, Bishop, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
I know every time I meet with you, we're always talking, and you're always sharing ways to help others and to teach, and so we really appreciate that.
You're
and
welcome.
Do you have anything else to add before we close with you?
No, just to get a word of gratitude to all of you. Really happy with your dedication and the massive importance of the work you do. I just want to impress that upon you. You're in the front lines. And this is one of the key battles going on right now in the life of the church, is the disaffiliation of our young people happening at the age that you're dealing with. And so to be mindful of that, and if this helps at all, to say, okay, I do understand the questions you have. Keep going. Keep going. Can I give you all a blessing before I go?
Please, please.
The Lord be with you, and may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and remain with you forever and ever.
Amen. Thank
Amen.
you,
God
Bishop.
bless
We're
you all.
praying for you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.